She's being arrested right now, and no one here understands why. The words cut through the noise of the busy intersection like a spark in dry air, coming from a live-streaming phone held high above the crowd, capturing every second of what was unfolding on a late evening in downtown Chicago, where traffic lights reflected off wet asphalt and the hum of engines filled the streets. A black Superbike stood parked at an angle near the curb, its engine still cooling as if it had just arrived from somewhere urgent and unseen. Standing beside it was Maya Carter, a 32-year-old black woman wearing a dark riding jacket, gloves still on her hands, her helmet tucked under one arm, her posture calm in a way that didn't match the tension building around her. Officer Daniel Reed stood a few feet away, his stance rigid, eyes fixed on her as if trying to place her in a category that made sense to him, while his partner Officer Mark Sullivan watched the surrounding crowd, which had already begun to gather with phones raised, recording, whispering, reacting in real time to something they didn't fully understand but were eager to interpret. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle," Reed said firmly, his voice carrying the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question, and Maya complied without argument, placing her helmet gently on the seat of the bike, as if it mattered more than the misunderstanding forming around her. She did not rush, did not protest, did not raise her voice. Instead, she looked at the officers with steady eyes that held no visible fear, only patience, as if she had been in situations like this before, though nothing about her appearance suggested why. Reed moved closer, scanning her license and registration, frowning slightly as the system on his handheld device took longer than expected to return a clean result. Around them, the crowd grew louder in fragments, short comments and guesses mixing with the sound of passing cars, while the livestream viewer count ticked upward without pause. "This doesn't make sense," Sullivan muttered under his breath, glancing at the Superbike again as if it alone raised suspicion. Maya finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, not defensive, not emotional, just direct. "I understand why you stopped me," she said, "but I also understand you don't have all the information yet." Reed looked at her sharply, as if that sentence itself was an escalation rather than clarification. "People don't usually ride machines like this through residential downtown traffic without drawing attention," he replied, and Maya gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with its implication. What neither officer noticed yet, or perhaps refused to consider, was how still she remained in contrast to everything around her, how even the crowd seemed louder than she was, as if she had already decided that reacting emotionally would add nothing to what was already in motion. A gust of wind moved through the street, shifting the reflection of neon signs across the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance a siren echoed briefly before fading again into normal city noise. Reed checked her identification once more, his expression tightening, as if he expected the system to correct itself and confirm whatever assumption he had already formed, while Maya stood there under the streetlights, unmoving, waiting in a way that felt less like submission and more like observation, as though she was studying the situation just as closely as they were studying her. The crowd leaned in slightly, sensing that something about this moment did not fit the pattern they expected, though none of them yet knew why. And in that widening silence between judgment and truth, the night seemed to pause just long enough for everything to hang in balance. The silence that followed lingered only for a moment before the reality of the situation began to shift under the pressure of attention, as more phones rose above the growing crowd and the livestream viewer count continued to climb, turning a simple roadside stop into something that felt larger than anyone standing there intended. Officer Daniel Reed stepped slightly closer to Maya Carter, holding her identification card between two fingers as if distance alone could give him more certainty about what he believed he was seeing. His eyes moved between the card and his handheld device, which continued to process her information slower than expected, the spinning indicator on the screen refusing to settle into the confirmation he was anticipating. Officer Mark Sullivan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only Reed could hear. "This is taking too long," he said, glancing again at the Superbike, its polished surface reflecting streetlights and passing headlights like fragments of broken glass on wet pavement. Maya remained still, her posture unchanged, helmet still resting on the seat of the motorcycle, her hands relaxed at her sides, not showing urgency, not showing irritation, as if she had already decided that rushing the moment would not change its outcome. Around them, the crowd shifted again, someone stepping forward to get a clearer angle, another voice whispering that they had never seen police hesitate this long during a stop like this, and the uncertainty began to spread quietly through the group. Reed finally spoke again, his tone more controlled but less certain than before. "Ma'am, where exactly are you coming from tonight?" he asked, as if the answer itself might resolve what the system could not. Maya turned her head slightly toward him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I was returning from outside the city limits," she said, her voice steady and precise. "I was not aware that my route would cause concern." Reed studied her face, searching for something that would confirm the assumptions forming in his mind, but found none of the usual signs he associated with nervousness or deception. Instead, there was only calm, an unsettling calm that made the situation feel less predictable. The handheld device in his hand finally emitted a soft tone, signaling a partial response, but the information displayed was incomplete, missing key verification markers that would normally appear instantly for an ordinary civilian record. Sullivan frowned at the screen. "That should not happen," he said quietly, almost to himself. A gust of wind moved through the intersection again, causing the crowd to shift slightly, jackets tightening, phones adjusting focus, and the sound of traffic filling the gaps between voices. Maya adjusted her stance slightly, not in reaction to the officers, but as if responding to the changing weight of the moment itself. "If there is an issue with my registration or identification," she said calmly, "I am willing to cooperate fully, but I believe there may be an error in how the system is interpreting it." Reed looked at her sharply at that statement, as though she had crossed an invisible boundary by suggesting the system itself could be wrong. "Are you saying there is a problem with our verification system?" he asked, his tone tightening slightly. Maya shook her head once, minimal and controlled. "I am saying there may be incomplete access to the correct database," she replied. That sentence created a subtle shift in Reed's expression, not yet understanding its significance, but sensing that it did not fit neatly into the scenario he had prepared for. Behind them, the live stream chat continued to flood with speculation, some assuming the situation would escalate, others questioning why the interaction felt unusually formal for a traffic stop. A nearby streetlight flickered briefly, casting alternating bands of light across the scene, and in that shifting illumination Maya's calm presence stood in contrast to everything around her, not defiant, not submissive, but observant. Reed exhaled slowly, glancing towards Sullivan before returning his attention to Maya. "We are going to need you to remain here until we confirm your status," he said, though even his own words carried less certainty than before. Maya nodded once, accepting the instruction without resistance, her eyes briefly moving toward the horizon line where the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware of how this small intersection had become a point of attention. And as the verification process stalled in silence between technology and assumption, the atmosphere around the officers and the crowd began to feel less like an investigation and more like a pause before something unknown revealed itself. The tension at the intersection deepened as the verification process continued to stall, leaving only the faint sound of passing vehicles and distant sirens blending into an uneasy silence that no one in the crowd seemed willing to break. Officer Daniel Reed kept his attention fixed on the handheld device, his thumb tapping lightly against the edge of the screen as if pressure alone could force the missing information to appear faster. Officer Mark Sullivan shifted his weight slightly, scanning the surrounding crowd that had grown more organized in its attention. With multiple phones now clearly recording from different angles, the glow of screens reflecting off faces that were beginning to expect something significant to happen. Maya Carter remained in the same position, calm and steady, her gaze occasionally moving from the officers to the street beyond, as though she were measuring time in a way that did not depend on the delay unfolding in front of her. Reed finally exhaled through his nose and lowered the device slightly, his expression tightening in frustration that was no longer directed solely at the situation, but at the lack of clarity itself. "There is a partial record match," he said, more to Sullivan than to Maya, "but it is not complete enough for confirmation." Sullivan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Partial match usually means system lag or outdated input," he said, though the uncertainty in his tone was beginning to match the confusion in Reed's eyes. Maya turned her head slightly toward them, her voice calm but precise when she spoke again. Then it is likely that the database being accessed does not reflect current federal clearance updates, she said, not raising her tone, not attempting to assert authority, simply stating a possibility as if it were an objective observation. Reed looked at her sharply again, this time more carefully, as if trying to decide whether her knowledge exceeded what would normally be expected in this type of interaction. The crowd behind them shifted again, one person stepping back to widen their recording frame, another whispering that the situation felt less like a traffic stop and more like an administrative delay involving higher authority. The wind picked up slightly, moving across the street and carrying the sound of distant traffic signals, while the reflection of overhead lights shimmered across the wet pavement in shifting patterns that made the entire scene feel suspended. Reed finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. If what you are suggesting is true, then you would have documentation that should be immediately verifiable, he said. Maya nodded once. Yes, she replied. But some credentials require direct access authentication rather than roadside verification systems. That statement caused a brief pause between the two officers, as Sullivan glanced at Reed with a subtle expression that suggested the situation was becoming more complex than initially assumed. Reed closed his eyes for a brief moment, then reopened them, focusing again on the device as if trying to reset his approach. The screen flickered once, then updated with additional fields, but still did not fully resolve into a complete profile. Behind them, a car slowed slightly as it passed, its occupants turning their heads to observe the scene, adding to the growing sense that the moment had become an unintended focal point of public attention. Maya adjusted her stance slightly, not out of discomfort, but as a natural response to the extended pause, her helmet still resting on the motorcycle seat, reflecting faint light from the street lamp above. I understand your procedure, she said calmly, and I will remain here until the verification process is complete. Reed nodded once, though his expression suggested he was no longer entirely confident in the assumptions that had initiated the stop. Sullivan glanced again at the crowd, then back at Maya, noticing the absence of agitation, the absence of urgency, and instead a composed stillness that did not match the expectation he had formed at the beginning of the encounter. The intersection remained unchanged in physical structure, yet the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, as if the delay itself had created a space where certainty was no longer guaranteed. And in that space, between incomplete data and patient silence, the situation continued to hold without resolution, waiting for the moment when the system or the truth would finally respond. The delay stretched forward without resolution, turning each passing second into a heavier presence within the intersection as Officer Daniel Reed continued to study the incomplete data on his handheld device, his expression tightening in small increments that reflected growing uncertainty rather than confidence. Officer Mark Sullivan shifted slightly closer, lowering his voice as another update attempt flickered across the screen, only to return with the same fragmented information that refused to align into a complete profile. Around them, the crowd remained focused, their phones steady, their attention fixed on a moment that had not yet resolved into clarity, while distant traffic continued to move normally beyond the circle of attention that had formed around the stopped Superbike. Maya Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed, her gaze occasionally moving between the officers and the surrounding street, as if she were observing the situation from a slight distance rather than being directly inside it. Reed finally lowered the device slightly and exhaled, his frustration now replaced by a more controlled but uneasy focus. We are not getting full confirmation from the system, he said, more as a statement of fact than instruction, and Sullivan nodded once, acknowledging what was already becoming clear. Maya spoke again, her tone even and deliberate. If the system is operating with limited clearance layers, then certain identities will not fully resolve without secondary authentication channels, she said, her words precise and measured, not argumentative but informative. Reed looked at her again, this time with less certainty in his assumption and more attention to her phrasing, as if her understanding of procedural limitations did not match the expectation he had formed at the beginning of the stop. Behind them, a passing vehicle slowed briefly, its driver glancing toward the cluster of lights and uniforms before continuing forward, while the glow of multiple recording screens continued to capture every angle of the interaction. Sullivan glanced toward Reed and spoke quietly. "We may need to escalate this," he said, not as a conclusion, but as a consideration, and Reed nodded slightly without responding. Immediately, his focus still divided between the incomplete data and the unusual calm of the woman standing in front of them. Maya adjusted her stance slightly, not in discomfort, but in response to the extended stillness, her helmet still resting on the motorcycle seat, reflecting faint light that shifted with each passing vehicle. The air around them felt increasingly static, as if the intersection had become separated from the normal flow of the city, suspended within its own delayed decision. Reed finally spoke again, his voice more controlled than before, but carrying a subtle shift in tone. "If your identification cannot be fully verified here, we will need to proceed under temporary detainment protocol until confirmation is received," he said carefully, watching her reaction closely. Maya did not react with surprise or resistance. Instead, she gave a small, calm nod. "I understand your protocol," she replied, her voice steady, "and I will comply until verification is complete." That response created a brief pause between the officers, as Sullivan glanced at Reed with an expression that suggested the situation no longer fit the assumptions they had initially operated under. Reed looked back at the device once more, then at Maya, then toward the crowd that continued to observe in silence broken only by recording devices and distant city sound. For a moment, there was no movement from either side, only the weight of incomplete information pressing against procedural certainty. And in that gap between what was known and what was not yet confirmed, the situation remained suspended, waiting for the system or the truth to finally resolve what had not yet been decided. The stillness at the intersection began to feel heavier as the officers maintained their positions, with Officer Daniel Reed now holding his handheld device slightly lower, as if the weight of the unresolved verification had begun to shift from technical delay into procedural uncertainty. Officer Mark Sullivan scanned the surrounding area once more, noticing that the crowd had grown quieter, not because interest had faded, but because anticipation had tightened into a focused silence, with multiple phones still recording every second of the encounter. Maya Carter remained in place, her posture steady and composed, her helmet still resting on the motorcycle seat beside her, reflecting the alternating glow of passing headlights and streetlights, while her gaze moved calmly between the officers and the surrounding environment. Reed finally spoke again, his voice measured but carrying a clearer edge of procedural transition. "We are going to proceed with a temporary detainment until higher-level verification is completed," he stated, no longer presenting it as a possibility, but as a formal decision shaped by incomplete confirmation. Sullivan adjusted slightly, preparing to follow procedure, while the crowd reacted with subtle shifts, a few murmurs passing through as people interpreted the statement in real time. Maya did not react with resistance or urgency. Instead, she gave a small, controlled nod, acknowledging the instruction without altering her calm demeanor. "Understood," she said simply, her voice steady and clear, carrying no frustration or emotional escalation. Reed stepped slightly forward, preparing to proceed with standard protocol, when a sudden shift in the surrounding environment interrupted the rhythm of the moment. From the far end of the street, a black unmarked SUV slowed as it approached the intersection, its headlights cutting through the reflective surface of the wet pavement before coming to a complete stop just beyond the gathered crowd. The presence of the vehicle immediately altered the attention of those filming, several cameras turning toward it as curiosity replaced speculation. The rear door opened without delay, and a man stepped out wearing a dark suit with a subtle federal insignia visible near his lapel, his movement calm and direct, without hesitation. Officer Reed noticed the arrival immediately and straightened slightly, exchanging a brief look with Sullivan that suggested recognition of authority beyond standard patrol procedure. The man approached with steady steps, stopping a few feet from the officers before speaking in a controlled and clear voice. "Officer Reed," he said, confirming identity without question, "this individual is currently under federal assignment status." The words did not carry urgency, but their weight immediately shifted the atmosphere around the intersection. Reed paused, his attention moving from the officer's face to the identification he presented, then slowly toward Maya, whose expression remained unchanged, calm and composed as she stood beside the Superbike. Sullivan took a half-step back, processing the statement as the crowd behind them grew even quieter, sensing that the situation had shifted beyond what had been previously understood. The federal officer continued, his tone steady and professional. "You are instructed to stand down and release custody immediately," he added, as though referencing a procedure already established at a level above the current engagement. Reed remained still for a moment, the device in his hand now lowered completely, the incomplete data no longer relevant in the presence of confirmed authority. Maya finally turned her head slightly toward the arriving officer, her calm expression unchanged, acknowledging the transition without speaking further. The surrounding street, once filled with uncertainty and fragmented interpretation, now held a different kind of silence, one shaped not by confusion, but by sudden clarification, as the procedural chain of command realigned itself in real time under the quiet weight of verified authority. The arrival of federal authority changed the atmosphere at the intersection in a way that was not immediate in sound, but absolute in presence, as the previously uncertain space between procedure and assumption collapsed into a clear chain of command. Officer Daniel Reed stood still, his posture now fully formal, his attention locked on the federal agent who had stepped forward, while Officer Mark Sullivan remained slightly behind him, his earlier tension replaced by a cautious readiness to comply. The federal agent maintained a steady stance, his expression neutral but precise, as he repeated the instruction with calm authority. "Release custody and step back from the individual," he said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that did not invite interpretation. Reed nodded once, acknowledging the directive, and immediately began the process of disengaging from standard detainment procedure. The cuffs that had not yet been fully secured were lowered, and the distance between officers and Maya Carter increased by a few steps, marking a visible shift in control of the situation. Maya remained composed throughout, her hands relaxed at her sides, her helmet still resting on the motorcycle seat, reflecting the streetlights that now seemed softer than before, as if the environment itself had adjusted to the change in authority. The crowd, which had been silent in anticipation, now reacted with subtle movement, phones still recording, but with a different tone of uncertainty, as viewers tried to interpret what had just been confirmed. The federal agent stepped closer to Maya, his voice lowering slightly as he addressed her directly. "We have confirmed external clearance validation," he said. "You are cleared to proceed." Maya gave a small nod in acknowledgement, her expression unchanged, neither relieved nor surprised, as if this confirmation was simply the expected resolution of a delayed process. Officer Reed exhaled slowly, glancing briefly at Sullivan, who responded with a slight shake of the head that reflected recognition of how quickly the situation had escalated beyond their initial assessment. Reed then looked toward Maya, his expression shifting from procedural certainty to measured reassessment, as if recalibrating the entire interaction in real time. "Understood," he said quietly, stepping further back to ensure full compliance with federal instruction. The federal agent turned slightly toward the officers. "This matter is closed at this level," he stated, his tone final but professional, removing ambiguity from the chain of command. Around them, the intersection remained physically unchanged, yet the perception of it had altered completely, as the earlier uncertainty had now been replaced by structured authority. Maya finally moved for the first time in several minutes, walking calmly toward her Superbike, placing her helmet securely in her hands, and pausing briefly as she looked across the street, where the crowd still stood, holding their devices, now witnessing a resolution they were still processing. The federal agent stepped aside, allowing her space, while Reed and Sullivan maintained their respectful distance, no longer participants in action but observers of closure. Maya mounted her Superbike with steady precision, her movements unhurried, and as she started the engine, the sound blended into the night air with a controlled power that contrasted with the earlier tension of silence. The headlights illuminated the street ahead as she prepared to leave, and in that moment, The intersection that had once held uncertainty now reflected only the quiet aftermath of verified authority, where every remaining presence understood that the situation had fully transitioned from question to resolution. The engine of the Superbike remained idling for a moment longer than expected, its low mechanical hum cutting through the quiet that had settled over the intersection, as Maya Carter sat in a steady posture that reflected neither urgency nor hesitation, only completion. Officer Daniel Reed and Officer Mark Sullivan remained several steps back, their stance no longer active but observant, as the federal agent stood near the edge of the roadway, confirming the final procedural clearance with a short exchange over his communication device before lowering it, and signaling that the situation required no further intervention. The crowd, still holding their phones, did not disperse immediately. As if waiting for meaning to fully catch up with what they had witnessed, their attention fixed on Maya as she adjusted her grip on the handlebars with calm precision. The streetlights reflected across the polished surface of the motorcycle, creating a soft glow that contrasted with the earlier tension that had filled the same space only minutes before. Maya glanced once toward the officers, her expression unchanged, not holding resentment, not holding acknowledgement beyond what was necessary, and then she looked forward down the open road. Behind her, Officer Reed shifted slightly, lowering his gaze for a moment as if replaying the sequence of events internally, while Sullivan remained still, his attention following the federal agent as he prepared to leave the scene. The agent gave a final nod toward the officers, a silent confirmation that the matter had concluded at his level, and then stepped back toward the unmarked vehicle parked a short distance away. The door closed with a controlled sound, and the vehicle began to move, slowly exiting the intersection and merging back into the city flow, leaving behind only the residual quiet of its presence. Maya's attention returned fully to the road ahead, and with a smooth motion, she released the brake and allowed the Superbike to move forward, its movement steady and controlled as it passed through the center of the intersection. The crowd instinctively shifted backward slightly as she approached, maintaining distance while continuing to record, their screens capturing her departure as a moment of quiet resolution rather than conflict. Reed turned his head slightly to follow her movement, his expression now neutral but reflective, while Sullivan exhaled slowly, adjusting his stance as the formal tension of the situation began to dissolve into ordinary street noise. The Superbike advanced through the intersection without acceleration or display, moving with deliberate calm, as if the entire sequence that had preceded it had already been filed away in silence. Maya did not look back again. Her focus remained forward, aligned with the road that stretched into the city beyond the lights, and as she continued onward, the sound of her engine gradually blended into the ambient rhythm of traffic. Behind her, the officers remained in place for a few more seconds, then began to return to standard posture, their attention shifting away from the center of the intersection as the crowd slowly began to lower their phones. The moment that had drawn them together began to disperse in fragments, leaving behind only memory and recordings, while the physical space returned to its normal state. Maya continued riding until the intersection was no longer visible in her mirrors, and the city opened ahead of her in steady lines of light and movement, carrying her forward into the quiet continuation of the night. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, its traffic continuing in steady streams of headlights and brake lights, while the intersection behind Maya Carter faded into the distance like a memory already being overwritten by routine movement and nightly rhythm. She rode forward along the wide avenue, her Superbike maintaining a smooth and controlled pace, the engine's sound blending with the surrounding flow of vehicles that filled the streets of downtown Chicago. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint humidity of late evening, and the reflections of storefront lights stretched across the pavement in long streaks that shifted as she passed. Inside her helmet, Maya's expression remained calm, her focus steady on the road ahead, not reacting to the earlier events in a way that would suggest either relief or tension, only continuation. Behind her, the city began to reduce the moment to fragments, unaware that what had just occurred at a single intersection had already been captured, shared, and interpreted in countless ways across digital space. In a quiet federal operations room several miles away, monitors displayed live incident summaries, and the brief notation connected to Maya's clearance status had already been marked as resolved, with no further action required. No urgency remained in the system, only archived confirmation. On the street, Officer Daniel Reed stood near the curb of the intersection, his posture relaxed compared to earlier, his attention no longer fixed on verification but on the space where the motorcycle had been. Officer Mark Sullivan adjusted his position beside him, exhaling slowly as the weight of procedural escalation faded into standard patrol awareness. Neither of them spoke immediately, as if both were processing the transition from uncertainty to closure without needing to verbalize it. The crowd that had gathered earlier began to break apart in small groups, some lowering their phones, others reviewing recordings that would soon circulate in fragments of interpretation, each version slightly different from the moment that had actually taken place. The federal agent's vehicle had already disappeared into the traffic pattern, leaving behind no visible trace beyond the memory of its arrival. Reed finally turned slightly toward Sullivan. "That escalated quickly," he said quietly, not as complaint, but as reflection. Sullivan nodded once. "It resolved faster than it started," he replied, his voice neutral, still observing the thinning crowd. Neither officer attempted to redefine the moment further. They simply accepted its conclusion as it had been delivered through higher authority. Meanwhile, Maya continued along the main route, passing intersections where pedestrians crossed under timed signals and vehicles merged in predictable patterns. Her presence in the flow of traffic was now indistinguishable from any other rider, the earlier disruption no longer attached to her movement through the city. She approached a stretch of elevated roadway, where the skyline opened more clearly ahead, revealing layers of illuminated buildings that stretched toward the horizon. The wind increased slightly at this elevation, moving across her jacket and adjusting the subtle reflections on the surface of her motorcycle. She maintained speed without urgency, her path uninterrupted, her attention forward. There was no glance back, no visible review of what had occurred, only forward motion into the continuity of the night. Behind her, the intersection had fully returned to its normal state, with traffic patterns restored and public attention already dispersing into unrelated conversations and digital interpretations. And as the distance between Maya and that location increased, the moment itself ceased to exist as an active event, becoming instead part of the city's unseen history, recorded but no longer unfolding, while she continued forward into the quiet structure of the road ahead. The elevated roadway carried Maya Carter forward into a quieter stretch of the city where the density of lights softened into wider gaps and the sound of traffic became more evenly spaced, blending into a steady rhythm that felt less like disruption and more like continuity. Her Superbike moved with controlled stability along the lanes, reflecting the glow of overhead lamps that passed in regular intervals, each one briefly illuminating her figure before fading behind her. Inside her helmet, her expression remained unchanged, focused entirely on the road ahead, as if the events at the intersection had already been filed away in a part of her mind that required no further attention. The city skyline unfolded in the distance, tall buildings forming vertical lines of light against the night sky, while the air grew slightly cooler as she increased elevation across the highway. Below her, traffic flowed in layered streams, headlights and taillights forming patterns that stretched across multiple directions, none of them aware of the brief disruption that had occurred earlier and already been resolved by higher authority. Maya maintained a steady pace, neither accelerating nor slowing unnecessarily, her movement consistent and deliberate. There was no visible reaction to the earlier encounter, no change in posture or rhythm, only forward motion as if her path had always been intended to continue without interruption. Behind her, the city gradually absorbed the moment that had drawn attention, reducing it to scattered digital fragments, brief recordings, and passing commentary that would soon lose context as new events replaced it. In federal systems far removed from the street, the incident file had already been finalized, marked as resolved under verified clearance, requiring no additional review. Officer Daniel Reed and Officer Mark Sullivan had returned fully to standard duty, their attention no longer focused on verification or uncertainty, but on the normal flow of their assigned area, where routine replaced anomaly and the night resumed its expected order. The federal agent's involvement had been logged and closed, leaving no active trace beyond procedural confirmation. Maya continued along the elevated roadway, approaching a long stretch where the city opened into a wider view, revealing distant bridges, illuminated towers, and moving lines of traffic that converged and separated like synchronized movement across a living map. The wind increased slightly at this height, passing over her jacket and adjusting the reflections across the motorcycle's surface, but she remained steady, unaffected by the environmental change in a way that suggested full control of both movement and attention. Her route carried her toward the outer districts, where the density of light decreased and the roads became more open, stretching into longer, uninterrupted lines. She did not look back at any point, nor did she adjust her speed in response to memory or reflection, maintaining a forward focus that defined her presence in the night. As she descended slightly from the elevated stretch, the city's sound shifted again, becoming softer, more spaced, with fewer intersections and more continuous movement. The Superbike's engine remained consistent, its tone blending into the environment rather than standing apart from it. In the distance, residential lights began to replace commercial brightness, signaling her gradual departure from the central urban core. The night carried on without pause, and Maya continued forward through it, moving beyond the point where attention had once gathered, beyond the intersection that had briefly held focus, and into the broader continuity of the road that extended ahead without interruption, where every remaining light and sound became part of a larger silence that followed her steady departure into the distance.